by AOVO Technology.
Starring Joaquin Phoenix, this Hollywood epic war masterpiece, Napoleon, is a legendary film. It depicts the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, starting from an obscure artillery lieutenant to ascending to the throne of the French Empire. The name Napoleon itself symbolizes an era, as his vast army once swept across Europe, but faced complete loss after a single defeat, leading to his exile on St. Helena, where he eventually passed away. The 16th to 18th centuries marked the peak of absolute monarchy in Europe, with Louis XIV of France being the most representative figure. However, in 1789, the corruption of the French political system and economic crisis resulted in social upheaval and intense public dissatisfaction, leading to the outbreak of the French Revolution. At that time, Queen Marie was led to the guillotine, and tens of thousands of people threw vegetables and eggs at her. The executioner lifted Marie Antoinette's white long hair, placed her neck on the groove, and as the rope pulling the blade was untied, the queen's head rolled to the ground. The executioner picked it up and displayed it to the crowd, marking the end of the monarchy that had lasted for 2 centuries. Among the crowd, a young man of only 24. No one knew that in the future, he would become the first emperor of France. Robespierre, the political philosopher instrumental in the revolution, ascended to the historical stage during his rule, commonly known as the Jacobin rule. Due to the profound impact of the French Revolution on other absolute monarchies in Europe, several countries, led by Britain, formed an anti-French alliance. They joined forces with the royalists within France, launching a series of counter-revolutionary uprisings. The coalition forces, approaching from the north, surrounded Dunkirk, the most important port in France, trapping half of the French fleet. For a newly established republic, this was a catastrophic blow. At this crucial moment, the republic needed an outstanding military leader to step forward and help win the war. After hearing the words of Robespierre's brother, Lucien, Napoleon volunteered to take on this heavy responsibility. He arrived at the military camp, seeking an opportunity to prove himself, and the upcoming battle provided the perfect chance to showcase his skills. After several days of preparation and reconnaissance, Napoleon identified the problems within the coalition forces. Taking advantage of the night, he led his troops, along with artillery, to the city. Napoleon ordered the placement of gunpowder along the city walls and used explosions as signals to unleash a relentless bombardment. The unprepared coalition forces could only endure the onslaught as the revolutionary army erected ladders to ascend the city walls. The coalition forces, too late to prevent the attack, found themselves at a disadvantage. Seeing his forces gaining the upper hand, Napoleon, determined to lead by example, rode his horse to join his soldiers in the melee. Unexpectedly, a cannonball from the coalition forces struck his white horse's chest, spewing blood and flesh between Napoleon's brows. Undeterred, Napoleon did not retreat. Rising again, he brandished his sword and ascended the city walls, bravely engaging the enemy amidst the continuous barrage. The enemy soldiers knocked him down, and a soldier aimed to end his life. Napoleon struggled to break free and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Seeing his army successfully capturing the city, Napoleon quickly ordered the use of the city's cannons to attack the coalition fleet in the harbor. One by one, the cannonballs streaked across the sky, sinking the anchored warships into the sea. The sea lit up with the continuous explosions, and the cries of the coalition forces echoed everywhere. Observing the mushroom clouds rising above the sea, Napoleon, with his blood-stained face, revealed a long-lost smile. The Siege of Toulon, this battle where the relatively unknown artillery captain Napoleon demonstrated his prowess, earned him the rank of general from Robespierre, a rapid promotion of 3 ranks. After the commendation, Napoleon approached his war horse and retrieved the cannonball shot by the coalition forces from its body. In that moment between life and death, he firmly believed that the white horse would bring him good luck. Although the French Revolution brought a brief period of enlightenment to France, the ambitions of the current French leadership were growing. They not only violently suppressed counter-revolutionary movements, but also imposed strict restrictions on market prices. Thousands of people lost their lives on the guillotine during this time. The National Convention witnessed severe riots, and Robespierre, attempting suicide, was unsuccessful. With Robespierre's head rolling on the ground, the era of terror in France came to an end. Over 40,000 prisoners were released, including the future Empress Josephine. In 1794, at a ball, Napoleon received an invitation and attended. While watching a performance depicting the beheading of Queen Marie, Napoleon showed no interest. However, the widow Josephine, standing nearby, caught Napoleon's attention. Throughout the entire ball, Napoleon stared at Josephine intently. Josephine noticed him and approached, asking why he was staring at her. Overwhelmed by seeing someone he admired, Napoleon stammered and rambled. Back at the military camp, Napoleon couldn't forget the encounter. Later, Josephine's son approached Napoleon, requesting assistance in retrieving his father's belongings. When Napoleon learned that the officer's belongings executed did not have his name, he casually picked a pair and went to Josephine's home. This provided him with the opportunity to spend time alone with Josephine. They quickly fell in love, began dating, and, despite Napoleon's rogue nature, Josephine confessed her less than honorable past. Napoleon, not holding any grudges, assured her he wouldn't despise her. The two eventually entered the realm of marriage. Initially, Napoleon, with a wife and child, thought he could continue to pursue his grand plans. However, he became unexpectedly devoted to his wife, Josephine, turning into a romantic who, during his campaign to liberate Egypt, wrote her 2 letters daily to express his longing. Unbeknownst to Napoleon, Josephine had already engaged in an extramarital affair with one of his soldiers. Unable to receive replies from his wife, Napoleon became melancholic, leading to poorly commanded battles. Unable to endure it any longer, Napoleon informed his subordinates that he intended to return to France with several warships, despite violating military regulations. Stubbornly, Napoleon left the camp. Seated in the carriage heading home, Napoleon inadvertently came across news of his wife's infidelity in the newspaper. Before even entering the house, he began shouting, inquiring about Josephine's whereabouts. Upon hearing that his wife had gone on a trip, Napoleon erupted in a tirade of insults towards the maid, releasing his pent-up emotions. After venting, he entered Josephine's room and threw all his personal belongings into the yard. Josephine, returning home, pounded on the door, begging for forgiveness. Softening, Napoleon eventually allowed her in, loudly questioning why she would act this way. Josephine, aware of the deep hurt she had caused, felt her explanations were futile at this point. Just when she thought Napoleon was going to cast her out, he unexpectedly offered her a lifeline, insisting that she could stay as long as she guaranteed to be his true love. From that point on, she was only allowed to enter his room. Josephine, acknowledging Napoleon's deep love for her, tearfully promised to love only him for the rest of her life. Napoleon, leaving behind the statement that without him, she was nothing, forgave Josephine. Taking advantage of her control over him, Josephine informed Napoleon that without her, he was a negligible beast. Under the influence of her psychological manipulation, Napoleon, looking into his wife's eyes, repeated her words and eventually burst into tears, crying uncontrollably. Josephine, seizing the opportunity, questioned if Napoleon had ever had an affair. After a night of brainwashing, Napoleon dared not hide anything and admitted to having done so. Unexpectedly, he pleaded with his wife not to leave him. Soon, news of Napoleon's unauthorized departure from his post reached the National Convention. In response, Napoleon declared his love for France was akin to his love for his wife. He likened his wife's infidelity to an invasion of France, and his departure from duty was to return and defend against external threats. Despite his passionate rebuttal, Napoleon left the parliament after standing up. After the aforementioned event, a member of the National Convention recognized Napoleon's unique charisma and approached him to discuss the possibility of staging a coup. If successful, Napoleon could assume the position of the first consul. After some consideration, Napoleon accepted the proposal. Soon, under the pretext of Jacobin threats, Napoleon persuaded the military to assist him in resisting the high ranks of the National Convention, taking control of all revolutionary government affairs. The existing French leadership was forced to resign, and Napoleon was duly crowned as the Emperor of France, with Josephine also being crowned as Empress. Both Napoleon and Josephine received support and admiration from the French people. During processions, Napoleon openly displayed affection with Josephine, and at home, they had no reservations about playful interactions under the dining table. Wearing a red velvet robe, Napoleon entered the Notre Dame Cathedral, followed closely by Josephine. Under the watchful eye of Pope Pius VII, the 35-year-old conqueror of Europe seized the crown, delivered a fervent speech proclaiming himself the savior of the nation, and placed the crown on his head. Subsequently, he crowned Josephine, marking the birth of the First French Empire. Despite becoming emperor, Napoleon remained discontent. After many years of marriage, Josephine failed to conceive an heir. In a sudden outburst during a gathering, Napoleon threatened Josephine, insisting that she must become pregnant tonight, or he would divorce her. Josephine retorted, and Napoleon, displaying childlike behavior, disrupted the party, leading to an unhappy dispersal. Back at home, Napoleon began apologizing profusely to Josephine, claiming his desperation for an heir as the reason for his outburst. Soon, Napoleon embarked on his pinnacle achievement in his military history, facing the anti-French alliance formed by Russia and Austria. At the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon gathered his forces, symbolized by the white horse associated with good fortune, rallying his troops. Upon learning that the Russian Tsar and Austrian Emperor intended to mimic his tactics, Napoleon ordered his troops to camp on a frozen lake, enticing the bulk of the coalition forces to launch a surprise attack on his camp. Sure enough, the densely packed 800,000 coalition forces advanced on the ice, swiftly approaching Napoleon's camp. Seeing the enemy about to fall into the trap he had designed, Napoleon ordered his camp's troops to actively engage in battle, successfully diverting attention. With a wave of his hand, Napoleon signaled the infantry hidden in the woods to charge down the hill, followed by cavalry emerging from the other side, completely surrounding the coalition forces. Trapped in the center, the coalition forces were helpless against the onslaught from all sides. Although Napoleon knew he had achieved victory in this battle, his face showed no signs of satisfaction. Instead, he coldly observed the battlefield below, resembling a hellish scene. At Napoleon's command, the artillery aimed the muzzles of 12 cannons at the coalition forces. Several cannonballs were fired, turning the ice into a starry field of death. Limbs of men and horses fell into the cold lake, and blood scattered like shattered crimson meteorites. As the coalition forces scattered in retreat, Napoleon did not relent. He ordered his forces to intensify the firepower, intending to make the coalition forces pay a heavy price. The Three Emperors' War lasted for 2 long months. Afterward, Napoleon and the Austrian Emperor Francis I shared an evening meal together, while the Russian Tsar, unable to accept the defeat, refused to meet Napoleon. Napoleon used Francis I to relay a message to the Tsar, expressing gratitude for not annihilating his entire army. After the war, Napoleon, longing for his wife, immediately returned home. Disappointed to see no changes in Josephine's belly, Napoleon's mother suggested him to try with another woman to check if the issue was on his side. Shyly, Napoleon entered the room prepared by his mother, blew out the candles, lay down, and after some time, his mother brought news of the girl being pregnant. Watching Napoleon's bewildered expression, Josephine also knew that the two of them had reached the end. However, Napoleon could never let go of this marriage with Josephine. Unable to be without an heir, he reluctantly divorced Josephine due to the circumstances. Even after reading the legal documents, Napoleon still told Josephine that she was the one he loved the most. Seeing Josephine hesitating as she read the divorce decree, Napoleon turned and slapped her to help her regain composure. After signing the papers, Josephine was sent to live in the Malmaison castle. Before leaving, Napoleon repeatedly instructed Josephine to write him a letter every day, not just one, but 2. Not only that, Napoleon would often visit Josephine, and upon meeting her, he would embrace her and shower her with kisses, expressing how much he missed her. In order to establish an unshakable alliance with Austria, Napoleon married Austrian Princess Marie-Louise. During their first meeting, Napoleon departed from his usual demeanor and proactively presented flowers, successfully winning Princess Marie's favor. Later, Princess Marie gave birth to a son for him. Upon seeing the child, Napoleon couldn't help but shed tears, fervently hoping that this was his child with Josephine. Napoleon took his son to meet Josephine, holding the young king in his arms. Josephine was at a loss for words, perhaps thinking that the child would only understand the sacrifices she made for him when he grew up. Due to the refusal of Tsar Alexander I to accept the peace treaty proposed by France, Napoleon had no choice but to invade Russia. Despite being far away, Napoleon kept writing letters to Josephine daily, detailing the various battles he experienced, with the most notable being the Battle of Borodino. However, this battle resulted in the death of 300,000 French soldiers on the battlefield. Although Napoleon successfully entered Moscow, the city was already deserted as its 200,000 residents had evacuated. In the deserted city, only a group of pigeons welcomed Napoleon. Sitting on the throne of the Russian emperor, Napoleon couldn't find happiness. He woke up to find the city in flames, and in his anger, he decided to spread the war to St. Petersburg. However, his generals warned that winter was approaching in Russia, and they were too deep into enemy territory with a stretched supply line. Going to St. Petersburg under these circumstances would likely be more harmful than beneficial. Deeply aware of the unfavorable situation, Napoleon had no choice but to reluctantly withdraw his troops. Ultimately, the French soldiers were unable to withstand the severe cold, and nearly half of them perished on the way back. Faced with the significant strategic mistake in this campaign, Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba. Starting from his divorce with his beloved Josephine, Napoleon had already distanced himself from the French people. Seeing reports in the newspapers about Tsar and Josephine's meetings, Napoleon decided to regroup and return to Paris. That night, he sailed back to Paris on a warship and met with the generals who had served under him before. These generals remained loyal to Napoleon, immediately joining his cause to continue the battle. Upon receiving news of Napoleon's return, King Louis XVI sent emissaries to stop him. Despite the generals preparing for battle, Napoleon calmly approached the soldiers, sharing his grand ideals. Half of the troops, who had previously fought alongside Napoleon, chose to lay down their weapons and support him. With their allegiance, Napoleon aimed to reclaim everything he had lost. The triumphant Napoleon returned to the pinnacle of power, joyfully arriving at the castle where Josephine resided. However, to his dismay, he learned that Josephine had tragically passed away a few days earlier due to diphtheria. Marshal Lefebvre informed Napoleon that in her final moments, Josephine had been calling out his name. With the departure of his beloved and the realization that France had reached an irreparable state, Napoleon was well aware that his country faced an inevitable crisis. However, driven by his honor, dignity, and the memory of his deceased wife Josephine, he decided to make a desperate attempt to bring a glimmer of hope to his homeland. The news of Napoleon's return quickly spread throughout European nations, leading to the establishment of the Seventh Coalition, a coalition of 700,000 troops assembled to decisively end Napoleon's rule. This campaign is famously known as the Battle of Waterloo. On the day of the battle, a sudden and violent rainstorm ensued. After carefully observing the situation, Napoleon decided to take action after the rain stopped. Faced with the previously oppressive French army, the Duke of Wellington was not fully confident. Reconnaissance reports on the enemy's situation were provided every hour. When news arrived that the Prussian army was only 19 kilometers away, Napoleon became somewhat impatient and ordered his troops to prepare the cannons. Before the Allied forces could react, cannonballs were already landing in their camp. After 2 waves of cannon fire, the French infantry advanced towards the Allied camp. Seizing the opportunity, the Duke of Wellington ordered his forces to open fire on the approaching enemy. At this moment, the reconnaissance report came in again, stating that the reinforcements were only 8 kilometers away. Seeing the imminent arrival of reinforcements, Napoleon became somewhat unsettled and ordered his cavalry to engage swiftly. Witnessing Napoleon dispatching his proud cavalry, the Allied forces immediately formed a square formation, catching the French cavalry off guard. Although the seasoned veterans who had experienced battles against the 3 emperors reignited their fighting spirit, ultimately, Napoleon's erroneous command led to their defeat. Napoleon stood in his tent, seemingly motionless, but immersed in the tragic symphony of war. Eventually, he stepped out of the tent, each step resembling the weight of the world pressing down, walking towards the narrow gap of destiny. In reality, Napoleon knew that once the Prussian and British forces joined, his defeat was inevitable. Still, he insisted on waiting until the rain stopped before launching the attack. He was well aware of the ultimate outcome of the battle, regardless of how it played out. Instead, he chose to wait for the 2 armies to converge, sparing himself some dignity in defeat. After the battle, Napoleon met with the Duke of Wellington and expressed his profound respect. Subsequently, Napoleon was exiled to the island of St. Helena. While spending time writing memoirs, he inquired about 2 little girls who burned something. The girls promptly replied that it was the Russians, but Napoleon insisted it was himself. In his eyes, that battle became a major turning point in his life. Due to issues such as the indiscipline of his army, Napoleon began to descend into a downward spiral. Perhaps the formidable adversary defeating him was not external, but his own ambitious and stubborn self. After consuming a glass of wine, Napoleon fell to the ground, meeting his demise. Thus concluded the epic and tumultuous life of this legendary emperor.
Powered by AOVO technology.